Nicholas Bornos of Capital Inc. and delighted to welcome you at another extremely interesting topic and panel of our forum. Shipping and the environment, pathways to a low carbon future. I think this is one of the most critical topics on everybody's agenda when it comes to shipping. We have a great group of panelists. I will turn it over to Dr. Arlie Sterling, the co-founder and president of Marsoft, who is going to introduce our panelists. I'd like to extend a huge thanks to Arlie and of course to Knut, to Graham, Modi and Loukas, and thank you for being with us. And Arlie, the floor is yours.
Nicholas, many thanks for organizing up this program. Indeed, the pathway to the zero carbon future is a critical topic for the industry. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel of distinguished business and intellectual leaders, people who are making decisions now who are going to lead the industry into its decarbonized future. I've asked everyone to take a look at a few questions to start the discussion going, but I expect this will be an opportunity to have a great discussion across the panel about the different decisions that are being made and how the timing looks for the industry. With that, let me introduce Mr. Knut Ørbeck-Nilssen, CEO, DNV Maritime, Graham Talbot, CFO, Atlas Corporation. Graham, some of us know you as C-SPAN, so forgive us for that reference. Mano, founder and CEO, MC Group, and Dr. Loukas Barmparis, president, Safe Bulkers. Gentlemen, many thanks for joining me today in this important discussion. Let me kick off by asking about timelines. 2050 seems a long way away, but many believe that it is imperative to achieve net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 or before. Nevertheless, the IMO estimates that shipping emissions continue to rise. What do you see as the feasible timeline for decarbonizing the shipping industry? And what have your customers and other stakeholders told you about their timeline? Graham, could you lead off the discussion on this point?
Sure, Arlie. Thank you for the invitation to join everyone today and the opportunity to participate in such an exciting topic. So the IMO target is to achieve a 70% reduction in carbon intensity and 50% absolute reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, with 2008 as the base year. So some of our customers have indicated that they will be net zero by 2050, so much more aggressive than the IMO targets. We see a majority of the shippers following the IMO ambitions, but it's got a lot of variable factors, depending on the clarity of the regulatory landscape, building in the increased cost of carbon, the available technology, and the availability of low cost and zero carbon fuels and their required supply chains. At this stage, given all of these uncertainties, it's pretty hard to pin down a timeline on decarbonisation. However, it's extremely encouraging to see the rate and the level of discussion and collaboration that's going on in the industry around it. I think a number of us are probably involved with various groups, including the Mercer-McKinney-Moller Zero Carbon Shipping Partnership. There's a number of other industry panels as well, working on carbon neutral solutions and alternative fuels. So I think the important thing at this stage from my perspective is that everyone's very engaged in the subject, and even if you look over the last 6 to 8, 12 months, the dialogue has picked up a lot of momentum, and the multiple pathways have also started to crystallize a lot more than they were quite a short time ago.
Gentlemen, Graham talks about collaboration and the necessity of kind of putting together the entire supply chain of zero carbon fuels. What do you see as the timeline and for putting that immense change into place? Modi, I'll turn it over to you to start out.
I agree with Graham that it's difficult to pinpoint a date or a deadline. I think our responsibility as an industry is to try and be always be a bit ahead of the curve. So there's compliance with regulation, and that probably sets the minimum standard from our perspective. That's what it should be. Like when class says you're either compliant with the CAS requirements, but you should always hope to be above that as well. So it's not only complying with regulations, which is relatively, I think, easy today for certain vessels or for most vessels, but it's going a little bit beyond that. But I think we also have responsibility as an industry not to, not to disrupt, not to overshoot. The supply chains, there are, energy considerations, there are power considerations, and I think we also the consequence of sometimes, pushing a little bit ahead of ourselves. And that could backfire at times. So I wouldn't necessarily try to set, hard deadlines beyond the regulation. We do need to comply, and we do need to strive well beyond, the compliance levels. But I don't think we should now, if theoretically one would say, let's stop all conventional new building orders, let's just order, alternative fuel vessels and make sure these are only E or green alternative fuels. Of course, the industry would collapse. Not the next morning, but a year or two later. So it's responsibility, I think, goes both ways. Go ahead of the curve, go beyond, but go responsibly.
So Modi, I think if people stopped ordering, I think it's the shipyards that would feel that pain most, and most ship owners would probably feel that they were in a better position as a result. I'm surprised to hear you say that
they stop ordering. I said stop ordering conventional and start ordering only alternative.
Okay.
I mean, which that's what should happen, but there's alternative, and that's kind of the discussion is probably going to develop in that direction too. Is it 100% green on day one? Is it a gradual transition from gray to blue to green? And is that going to take 5 or 10 years, or or 30, 40 years? So there's no black and white here, I think. But I just think that setting a deadline, which may not be realistic, is as risky as not having deadlines, of course, because it could backfire.
Absolutely. Knut, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, there's, both Modi and Graham really pointed out some really valuable insights. Maybe I can just throw in a slightly different perspective to your question, Arlie, and that is, I'm not so concerned about, setting declarations for when shipping should be zero emitting. I think it's much more important that we are actually taking some first steps and get the momentum going. And I think on this panel, there are some great examples of that, taking the first steps. And then, as Modi said, it's really about transition. It will take time, and we cannot move from where we are today to sort of the ideal shipping industry over a short time span. This is going to take decades, and I'm also pretty confident that when we will have the IMO discussions later on, also the timeline that has been set and agreed so far most likely are under a lot of pressure to be put forward. But putting it forward isn't really the important thing. The important thing is to actually do something and do it now, because we don't really have any time to waste. And that would be sort of my 2 pence on this question, Arlie.
Loukas.
Yes, I definitely agree with all the people who spoke before. The question is the actual regulatory solution is a gradual adaptation, which we all have to comply until 2050 onwards. And because otherwise you cannot do much more, because there are no fuels right now available. So there are proposals, we have methanol, we have hydrogen, ammonia, but we don't have any actual size. The vessels must be produced by shipyards. Networks must be made of the fuel that will be chosen, or the fuels that will be chosen. And I don't feel that it's an easy task, because simply we don't have the technology right now to go to zero emissions vessel. Maybe we'll have it later, but we don't have it now. And when we speak about net zero emissions, maybe someone could think that the company, a shipping company, let's say, could invest in shipping and have some emissions and could invest in another activity and have, let's say, negative emissions, and that could make a net zero effect. But we cannot have a zero emissions by 2050 from ships as we go right now. We need to have more research. We need to decide about fuel in the next period as soon as possible. We don't have the fuel. And we're considering, for example, LNG, which is, it seems to be more problematic than it used to be a month ago, because we also have restrictions on LNG use. And LNG could be a solution, but because, for example, if you have a vessel which emits 30% lower emissions, and you also introduce LNG on this vessel, and you go to 50. But how can you go to 100% reduction in order to have a neutral ship? I think it's quite difficult, and we need to hire, and the industry and the research needs to go faster.
No question that the new options need to be developed and research needs to go faster. And we heard from Graham talking earlier about the need to collaborate in ways the industry hasn't. But Loukas, let me ask you about your customers, your charterers. When they talk to you about decarbonization and pathways, collaboration to decarbonization, do they talk about a timeline? Do they say, what kind of urgency do you hear from them?
Look, I think that, the things that we have done are, we are testing quite often some biofuels, so which represents a reduction on carbon, on CO2 emissions, and sometimes quite substantial. If you move, let's say, from 20% to 30%, this could be a substantial reduction. We also compete on the basis of let's say, phase 3 vessels, which will come. The first phase 3 vessel is coming next month, I think in May, and we have 8 of those. So we have a very good level of competition against the market, because of the other market, there are no phase 3 vessels which are, let's say, by 30% in specific characteristics. They are by 30% lower emitting for CO2. So I think that the customers target to see a gradual reduction. Also, ourselves as management, we try to reduce our footprint in a manageable way. So we introduce energy efficient devices in more heavy vessels. Sometimes we have sold older vessels and less efficient, and we are ordering new ships with 30% higher efficiency. All this that we are doing is trying to target this 2030 limits, the 2040 limits, the 2050 limits gradually. And we are doing that simply because there is no other solution right now. We cannot go and order a ship with that burns, for example, ammonia, or even if we order it, we cannot. Where can we find ammonia? Or even biofuel you cannot find in many places. You can find in Rotterdam, maybe sometimes in Singapore, but it's not widespread. So I think there are substantial problems on all these issues, how to deal with.
Look, that's a great transition to the next question. And we talked about first movers, we talk about industry pressure. Maersk's recent decision to order methanol-capable vessels and to invest in e-methanol production facilities is a compelling indication that e-methanol will be the zero emissions fuel of the future. Do you agree? Modi, you're close to this one.
Yeah, so we definitely agree that methanol could be one of the most relevant fuels of the future. I would not necessarily say the winner takes it all. I think we're going to have more than one relevant and important and significant fuel, for the future. And I think the key here is the word that we've mentioned a number of times already is the transition. So there's methanol, and you mentioned e-methanol and Maersk's first move. Well, Maersk's move was pioneering in the sense that they said we're going to use only e-methanol, and we're building e-methanol vessels. But actually, our fleet, with the first ships, dual fuel methanol vessels, were delivered already in 2016. So that means that they were designed and ordered in between 2012 and 2014. And that's already almost 10 years back. So thinking a little bit during 2020, when we all had time, when we were locked up at home, and during the good old COVID days, we think, what is our path to a cleaner future, to a transition, decarbonization and transition in shipping? And we thought, what does the fuel actually need to have? So of course it needs to be compliant with regulation, and methanol is compliant today. And the great thing about it, and the thing we really liked about it, is that you could see how it could continue being compliant well into 20, 30, 40 years down the line. While the methanol we use today is perhaps called gray methanol, on a well-to-wake basis, it does, there's carbon in the process, and it emits carbon, of course, but it can gradually transition towards blue methanol, and thereafter green methanol, and we know there's the feasibility, the technological solutions to produce sufficient e-methanol or green methanol, but that's just going to take time. And the nice thing about methanol is that methanol is methanol. Whatever the ingredients are, it's the same commodity, it's the same product which goes through your system, through your engine, and you don't need to make any modifications as it becomes greener. So we could tick that box with methanol for sure. We thought that marine fuel should be safe. They're never 100% safe. We're always dealing with combustion and with elements of risk here. But we found that methanol is a safe solution, and there are good procedures and good mitigations to any of its adversaries. We thought about easy handling. We thought that the right direction should be a fuel which is liquid at ambient temperature, which we can handle as the bunkers we handle today. It doesn't need to get overcomplicated. I think shipping is becoming quite complicated as it is. The technology on board, the requirements from the crew, the safety issues, etc. So with methanol, it's something which is much more familiar to us. It's a liquid than some other fuels that you compare, for example, with LNG, and definitely with ammonia. We can rely on existing technologies, on proven technologies. And when we finally found the solution, basic to our ambition, which was setting up clean sea transport and acquiring the Marinvest dual fuel methanol fleet, we knew we could rely on 40,000 engine running hours already in that fleet. And up to date, there's about 100,000 of engine running hours, on the global fleet running on methanol. So the technology is existing, it's proven, it works. We took delivery recently of the third generation of dual fuel methanol tanker. It means that we've already seen improvements, enhancements, and a lot of lessons which have been learned. The fourth important element, of course, is availability of fuel. Again, as Loukas mentioned, if we look at ammonia today, is it there? Is it available? How are we going to handle it? What are the volumes we're going to see? How are those volumes in comparison to global ammonia trade today? Just using ammonia as an example, but with methanol, it's available as a liquid. It's the same liquid that we can use as a bunker fuel. It's available in over 100, about 117 ports today. Not always as marine fuel, but the adjustment is just a matter of getting that critical mass in terms of number of ships out there. And then we're going to see also the marine fuel, the methanol bunker tankers and methanol marine fuel supply networks. And we're working hard in that direction. And of course, there's the cost effectiveness. Now, none of those fuels is going to be cost effective when compared with fuel oil, HFO, or low sulfur fuel oil today. But compared with each other, we measured over time, with historical rates and looked a little bit about the forward curves, and we found that methanol could be cost effective when compared with the alternatives, LNG and ammonia. Now, each one of those products has different supply-demand dynamics, different pricing dynamics. At times, we're going to see LNG being cheaper, as we've seen it, for many years. Now it's extremely expensive. At times, we're going to see methanol being a cheaper solution, and I don't think we have any visibility about ammonia, for example. Now, the important thing, the one cost we can control, because it's going to be difficult to control the forward rates, is the capex. And the other thing we liked about this is the capex for dual fuel methanol solution is relatively low when compared to cooling plants, to the LNG solutions, and also, to the same extent, OPEX is quite attractive. So to answer your question, yes, I think methanol can be one of the winners, and it has a great future ahead of it. We believe in it. We've invested in it heavily, and we will continue doing so. But I wouldn't say e-methanol is the one and only solution today. We're going to get there. We need to be blue before we get green, and we need to be basically we need to be able to walk before we run.
Graham, I'm sure certainly Maersk is one of your leading customers, and I'm sure you have lots of conversations with them about the kinds of ships they want and what kind of pressure they're seeing from their clients in this regard. Do they talk to you about methanol?
Yeah, certainly. As an ex-Maersk employee, I also have to sort of compliment them on their courage in taking the position they're taking. That being said, we're currently building 70 new container ships, and 25 of those are dual fuel LNG. A number of the conventional ones are ammonia ready with tank and piping. We're also working on methanol with Maersk and some other customers as well. So I think, as most of my colleagues have said, that one, there's going to be a transition. This is going to take quite a bit of time. And I think during that transition, there's not going to be one fuel. I think it'll be dependent on trading location, type and size of vessel, etc. And we will probably be running with a few different options for some time. And then ultimately, maybe we will consolidate back into one area. Every one of the options has pros and cons. So methanol clearly is a strong runner, but so is green ammonia with its energy density and its lower temperature for storage, so therefore lower energy overall. But there's other negative attributes to ammonia as well in terms of corrosion and shipping, etc. So we've got a lot of smart people in the industry in the world that will sort these problems out for us. So back to Knut's problem or comment, the most important thing now is that we're all working on it together with the engine manufacturers and the customers, and for me, the customers are the liners, in terms of working out these pathways. And then it starts to get more complicated and interesting, I guess, when you start to work from LNG through to e-LNG and clean LNG solutions with synthetic gases as well. So there's multiple pathways, and from my perspective, it's too early to call a winner.
Thanks, Graham. Knut, I've always thought of D&V as looking at the ships. Now you've had to focus on the entire supply chain. Are you seeing methanol ahead of the pack in that regard, or where do you see that Maersk's decision?
Well, I think the Maersk decision and initiative should really be complemented for the fact that they're looking upstream, how to incentivize the production and the infrastructure and the port facilities to provide methanol and preferably blue or green methanol. And of course, one of the big players like Maersk or any of the other big liners can have a significant influence in this respect. But I think it's, a lot has been said already, but coming back to what Loukas said, I think when you look at the shipboard technology, maybe we're in the sort of range 4 to 8 years before we have sorted out the issues around both, say, methanol and ammonia, and maybe more so on the ammonia side than the methanol side. But the real challenge is to provide sufficient quantities of either the blue fuels or the green fuels. And not only the production, I mean, this is basically either coming from renewable sources, and we all know it takes a long time to develop these facilities. And then on the blue fuel types, you have the carbon capture and storage technologies that also needs to be developed. And that's why I'm very hesitant to point to a winner in this respect. I think, like has been pointed out, we will have a multitude of different fuels going forward. But the real issue for the world, and not only for shipping, but for the economy, is to produce sufficient green or blue fuels for the maritime transition to sort of move towards net zero. And that is quite a significant task, and it's not something that shipping can resolve on its own. Here we basically need to have some public and private partnerships, more R&D, and I think this is, you know, it's a very challenging setting, but it's certainly a very inspiring setting to attract talent and new talent into the industry. And I think, you know, expanding on our networks and the ecosystem will be incredibly important. And that's why also with DNV, we have the expansion into the renewables, the oil and gas, carbon capture and storage technology. So I think that could be quite a useful knowledge base for the industry to tap into. Sorry for a long answer, but there you have it.
Gosh, I can't tell you how much I agree, Knut, with your point about broadening the discussion and bringing new people into the industry and helping us find solutions. It's been extraordinary to speak to a range of people who are committed to decarbonization, who have great ideas and have a very forceful approach to articulating those ideas. As you know, here in the States, and I'm conducting this moderating this panel from the States, but one of the things we've learned is how important farmers are when one chooses alternative fuels. And so anything that sounds like it might be grown on a farm has a certain momentum built into it here in the States. And apropos your point about collaboration and this not really being an industry, or the shipping is not going to lead the way on this, I think finding who is going to lead the way is going to be an important part. Loukas, any quick comments from you? I know you've been a pioneer in the biofuel side and you've seen that transition at work.
Yes, I think whatever was spoken until now was very wise, and I agree with everybody. And the question here is we have some words that we are using. For example, we're using the word E for environment, then methanol, ethanol, or fuel, or hydrogen, or nitrogen, etc. So, or ammonia, whatever. So, first of all, the question is whether it's E, what we are consuming. Second is the fuel, what type of fuel. And methanol, I mean, you can produce methanol or any other biofuel or biodiesel or several other fuels that can be compatible. The problem is that we need, if we want to achieve a quicker solution, we need not to broaden the discussion in many fuels, but to focus in one runner. Whatever is the runner, I don't believe that biofuels or even methanol, I mean, the world has so great capacity, or the farmers to produce such quantities of biofuel that is needed, or bioethanol or biomethanol, whatever. The question is, and also you have a ship that goes everywhere. You cannot have, let's say, I have a ship that burns methanol, I'll go to Singapore. The other ship burns biofuel, I'll go to Rotterdam. You cannot do that. You need a common fuel. And the success of HFO was that it was available, the similar fuel, I mean, of the same quality in all parts of the world. So you need to decide one fuel which to be able to burn it safely and carry it safely in a vessel, and have the characteristic E in front of this fuel. So I don't feel that right now we're going towards the right direction. We will moving here and there. Each one of us is doing something, but nothing really global.
Loukas, that's a great observation. I think we talk about collaboration. It often seems to me to say, gosh, look at the smorgasbord of alternatives we all have. And it almost seems like it's slowing things down. The industry could commit to a solution and perhaps accelerate the pace of decarbonization by making that commitment. But I think it's a very complex issue. Let me just introduce what I think is the great benefit of shipping and our great challenge right now. The IMO, let's face it, has a much less urgent approach to decarbonization than many stakeholders in the industry. I personally, I can sympathize with the IMO perhaps, but I think it's a problem for us. The stakeholders from the banking side, from the insurance side, in some cases from the chartering side, they seem to be ahead of the IMO. Who's going to drive the pace of decarbonization in shipping? Is it the regulators? Are we all going to have to do what they say? Or are the charterers going to get ahead of the discussion, or someone else, or the bank's going to lead that financing discussion? Graham, Loukas, I'll give that one to you to start off with.
So, yes, that's a very good observation. First of all, we need regulators, because if we didn't have regulators, we wouldn't move at all to any direction, and no one would move to any direction, even charterers or bankers or ourselves. So in this framework that has been created, sometimes, let's say, some bodies have a quicker or faster response, like EU, for example. Other bodies have a slower response, like IMO. At the end of the day, there is a response, and what we care, all of us, what we want to see is that let's say in the next 2-3 decades, we will achieve a target where we will not emit more CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, and we go to a neutral, let's say, overall life. The question now is, as I told you, we are, in our company, we follow a very pragmatic approach. A pragmatic means is that what you can do now and what you cannot do is, okay, let's do it later. So the pragmatic approach says, if you have a vessel, for example, that is heavy, then do some jobs to make it lighter. For example, put some energy efficient devices that will reduce the CO2 emissions. This is a good approach, and I think this is also a global approach by all the by the shipping community. The second problem, the second issue is that, of course, okay, you may reduce the speed, but then you lose also competitiveness if you reduce the ships. So if you have better ships, you can compete better. If you have, let's say, heavier ships, you don't compete. And it's also this that is driven by the charterers, because the charterers would like to have, I mean, the big charterers, at least our biggest charterers, all have sustainability policy, and they want all of us to see this performance. So either through energy efficient mechanisms or through using biofuel, you can always achieve a better environmental responsiveness and be also at the same time competitive. At the same time, we also have, let's say, sustainability linked loans, which penalizes when we don't have, we don't achieve certain targets, and gives us incentive when we do that. I think the industry itself tries to motivate everybody towards the direction of faster decarbonization, while IMO is going to a more safe pace, I would say, that is more focused on the safety of supply rather than the quicker decarbonization. Because imagine if you exceed certain limits, then you risk to have to go to a solution which will be very expensive. So I think that in this respect, we need to be pragmatic. And again, I would like to repeat that it's most important issue is whether we can decide a fuel, because any fuel can be burned. I mean, methanol, of course, you can have an engine that burns methanol, diesel, biodiesel, whatever. The question is if you have it available, if you have it worldwide, if it has standard quality, and if it's E. Otherwise,
Loukas, I think your observations about what we can do right now and the little steps for little feet is sometimes how I think about it. That's a very powerful one. It's one we have at Marsoft pursued by trying to ease the path to getting carbon credits for the kinds of investments that you described in the energy saving devices. And there, of course, we have a market for carbon and reduction in CO2 emissions that will pay for it. Let me shift the chemical compound under discussion for a moment. We've been talking about CO2, but a lot of people believe that a major achievement at COP26 was restricting methane emissions and specifically targeting a 30% reduction in methane emissions relative to 2020 by 2030, an aggressive 10-year time span. At the same time, the shipping industry is going to, in all likelihood, rapidly ramp up the use of LNG. And the use of LNG is associated with methane emissions. And I think there was a reference earlier about that we've recently learned that those methane emissions may be a more serious problem than we initially anticipated. Knut, I'd like to turn this one over to you. Where do you see methane impacting the shipping industry?
Well, first and foremost, I think it was a very important decision being made at COP26 to reduce the methane emissions in the upstream chain. That's basically what we are talking about. So that will make gas much more relevant as a fuel when we consider well to wake. So I think the investments done in dual fuel gas engines, I mean, now there's a real spike in the price, but given that development, that is beneficial for the emission profile of gas. And then if you sort of move to the onboard technology issue of methane slip, now that is really a Mickey Mouse problem compared to the methane emissions that we talk about in the upstream chain. And we are working very closely with the main engine manufacturers, and they are all working on technologies to take out that methane slip, or at least reduce it significantly. So for me, that's not really a good argument against using gas as a fuel. That is a technology issue. I'm pretty confident that that will be greatly reduced. And anyway, using the modern technologies of today, it is greatly reduced to the engines and the technologies used in the beginning especially on the ferries. So my take on this is it will make gas and LNG much more relevant. And let's face it, there is an abundance of gas available in the world, and it could provide a significant transition into, say, an even better fuel future. But you also have the, like Graham pointed to, you can do the bio LNG, the e-LNGs. So I mean, many talk about a bridge, but I really see that as a very long bridge. But the most important thing is it will be a significant part of the transition into zero emission futures at some stage.
So Knut, you really see the COP26 decision to limit methane emissions as encouraging the use of LNG in shipping? Absolutely. No doubt about it. Graham, I got to turn it over to you. You're building 25 LNG powered ship, or dual fuel, powered ships. How has the methane emissions played a role in your decision to invest in that regard, or C-SPAN's decisions?
Yeah, of course, it's been a key decision, but as Knut said, there's a lot of clever people working on this, whether it be once again through industry collaboration with Lloyd's Register Methane Initiative as an example, but also with the engine manufacturers. So once again, maybe I'm a little bit blind in my confidence, but I'm very confident of the smart people working on these issues. And I think now that we have people pointed in the right direction with the right sense of urgency, I think these things will be managed successfully in the short term.
Modi, any comments from you as you take a look at methane? I don't know, are there issues associated with methanol and methane emissions? Forgive me for my ignorance.
No, not as such. I agree with my colleagues here that wherever there's a technological solution to be had, it's going to be found. And the good people working on those things, smart, and we've overcome, much more complicated issues. And, methanol has other technological challenges. We use, I think that's relevant also for LNG, but, using the pilot fuels, for example, which means that even when you have, work on your secondary fuel, which is methanol, you're going to be using the pilot fuel, which is diesel or HFO, for the ignition, or LSFO for the ignition. even that is on track in terms of getting, technological solutions. And the use of the pilot fuel is going to be reduced. Initially, the amount, the percentage of it. Later on, perhaps we'll look into electrical plug ignition, and eventually that issue is going to go away. And I think that's also the case for the methane slip. And so the technology is going to be there. When there's a will, there's a way. It's I think some other points which were raised here about availability and time and transition, those are the more relevant issues. I don't think anything technological is going to stand in our way, basically.
Got to turn this back to you, Knut. There's no technological barriers to decarbonization, is what I think I just heard from Modi. Do you agree?
Nicely taken to the extreme, but yes.
Yeah.
I've got to do something as a moderator, Modi. Forgive me.
But that is actually also what we have concluded in our research, that the real important step now is policies and regulations, and technology will follow. I'm pretty confident, but it's a question of investments, naturally.
However, I agree with Knut about the LNG, and quite often I have said it several times, because if you want to be pragmatic, you need to have a fuel. And right now we have many fuels, but we don't have a fuel. LNG, for example, is worldwide. You can find LNG in various places very easily. The problem of methane slip is, as we said, can be solved easily or more difficult, but it can be solved. What the LNG produces before the ship, from the well, it's another issue, but this issue is a global issue because everybody is using LNG in so many countries. For example, Germany produces, 67% of LNG in their balance. So I think if we want to be pragmatic, we need to produce a ship for the next, let's say, 20 years, which is LNG. Second is a phase 3 or maybe phase 4 vessel with energy efficient devices, and reach a 50–60% CO2 reduction. Now, from that point on, if we want to go to 100%, to neutral ship, then we need to produce another fuel, which is something completely different. Maybe ammonia, hydrogen, methanol, biofuels, etc. I don't believe biofuels are the end, are the solution of the problem, because they have restrictions which are related to the land that is used. So we need to go to something which is, let's say, either a hydrogen or ammonia. Let's say the hydrogen needs a lot of pressure, or ammonia that is corrosive, or I don't know, maybe something which is could be very, very doubtful. Many people will doubt about maybe small nuclear reactors that will not produce any CO2 emissions whatsoever, suitable for vessel application. So I think there are all these solutions, but the world must take a decision which way to go, and not to leave to the users, because we as ship companies are the users. And when you go to buy a car, you don't ask, okay, you have, let's say, two solutions. You have either diesel or you have a gasoline. You don't ask, okay, what do you want to develop for your car?
Loukas, excuse me, I have to interject, and I see Nicholas is here. I'm actually trying to buy a car, and I can tell you that's the last thing you do now, but it's too darn expensive to even think about it.
Yes.
Many thanks, gentlemen, for this, for the panel, and for the opportunity to discuss the most important issue facing our industry over the next 20 years. Nicholas, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you to all of you. Great panel.
Thanks, Arlie.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Arlie. And gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Loukas. Knut, thank you all.